Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Welcome to part two of our One Ocean Hub-led activity, Breaking Laws on the Sea. This is a follow-up activity to the UN Nippon Fellows uh, uh, based on the success of our initial discussion during World Oceans Day. My name is Alana Lancaster, and I am an environmental and energy lawyer specializing in the marine environment. I'm Guyanese by birth, but based at the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados. My interests are in international and regional comparative law in my areas of specialty and added to the body of research in the Caribbean region. Before we begin, let's do some housekeeping. All sessions are set to auto-record, and we hope to share these via YouTube after the event for anybody who could not join. The images, audio, and any slides shared by any of the panelists or speakers will be included. If you do not wish to be recorded, please let us know or let the host know at the start, and we will not include these in the YouTube materials. Please use the chat to the audience. Please use the chat functions to introduce yourselves and tell us the region you're from. We want you to get to know each other. If you do not wish to be recorded, please let us know or let the questions will be posed during the Q&A function. Please indicate the name of the panel member you are directing your question to at the start of the question that you are answering. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, but please, as we go along, if you have questions, just pop them in there. We will make note of them. Now, this event is organized by the early career researchers from the One Ocean Hub. The One Ocean Hub is an independent program for collaborative research for development funded by the UK government, UK Research and Innovation through the Global Challenges Research Fund. GCRF is a key component in delivering UK aid strategy and puts UK-led research at the heart of efforts to tackle the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Hub is a community of scholars from 22 leading international universities and research centers from the UK, South Africa, Ghana, Namibia, Kenya, South Pacific, and the Caribbean. Led and hosted by the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, we are working together with 30-plus project partners, including UN agencies, regional intergovernmental organizations, national government departments, community representatives, NGOs, charities, and media organizations. We are united in a shared passion for the ocean and optimistic in our search for transformative approaches. And for more information on the One Ocean Hub, please visit our website. So a little bit about the inspiration for today's webinar. As we emphasize efforts to restore and protect our oceans and fulfill the objectives of SDG 14 becomes very important. SDG 14 encompasses the expansion of protected areas for marine diversity and existing policies and treaties that encourage responsible use of ocean resources that are still insufficient to combat the adverse effects of overfishing, growing ocean acidification due to climate change, and worsening coastal eutrophication. As billions of people depend on oceans for their livelihoods and food sources, and the transboundary nature of oceans, increased efforts and interventions are needed to conserve the sustainability of ocean use and resources at all levels. One of the factors which impacts on the achievement of these goals are illegal activities, which take place on the ocean, as they can compromise the resource, its ecosystems, and species and investments into the ocean economy. The aim of this panel will be to hear from experts from different regional, disciplinary, and professional backgrounds about the interaction between small-scale fisheries, large-scale fisheries, and the trade in fish and seafood, and its link to ocean crimes, collectively termed illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. Join me in welcoming my fellow panelists, Laura Major, Alexander Winkler, Michelle Wahome, and Mitchell Lennon. And I will just give you an introduction to what is IUU fishing before we get into hopefully you're seeing my screen. Yes. All right. So what then is IUU fishing? And which we will be discussing. Now, as described by Petrosian and Pezzella, IUU fishing is a serious global environmental crime, which is not only a threat to oceans and fish stocks, but also food security and the communities that depend on them. And we will go through statistics that show you the heavy reliance on coastal communities on fisheries. Now, IUU fisheries, fishing therefore directly impacts on marine habitats and organisms, as well as the economies and ecosystems of coastal states and millions of people who depend on fisheries for their survival. There are also impacts on the legal framework that countries set up to manage commercial fishing industries, and also the ecosystem services and processes that coastal ecosystems provide. Yet the concept of IUU fishing is a broad one. As we see in the image to the right of your screen, it encompasses several practices, including non-reporting, misreporting, or underreporting, fishing and fishing-related activities that are in contravention to either international, regional, or national laws, fishing with stateless vessels, fishing in contravention of regional fisheries agreements by non-party vessels, and fishing activities which are not regulated by states. Now, while the precise definition is challenging, and indeed many scholars, for example, in our last Breaking Laws on the Sea, one of our presenters, Dahia Bel Habib, and also Maniba Isaacs challenged the definition or the description, and maybe more accurate, by the FAO on IUU fishing. What I think everyone is almost universal in agreement is that the impact of IUU fishing is tremendous. Both ecosystems, in that we see a loss of 11 to 26 million tons of fish each year lost at a value of 10 to 23 billion US dollars. These are UN statistics given in 2020. So it is therefore no surprise that the issue of IUU fishing is engaging international community, and we've seen calls from UNEP, for example, to have regional seas programs, large marine ecosystems, and regional fisheries bodies work together, as well as it being part of the Sustainable Development Goal. Now, SDG 14.16 is dedicated to measuring achievements made towards the ambitious target of eliminating IUU fishing by 2020. However, based on the recent assessments of the IUU fishing index done by McFadden and al. In 2019, this target is largely unattainable, and there should be a call to action in specific regions and ocean basins. And just to say, we will be providing a reference list of sorts to some of the publications and other things we reference in this webinar. Now, further, as the report commissioned by the High Level Panel for the Sustainable Ocean Economy called Organized Crime in the Fisheries Sector, it is clear that IUU fishing is also a gateway or an accompaniment to other activities which are clearly viewed as illegal. This will be illustrated in the Jamaican case study, and this undesirable pairing has deleterious effects, social and human rights consequences, as will be outlined in case studies in small scale fisheries and in the Ghana case study. There is also cause for concern with respect to the negative effects of subsidies and psycho fishing in Ghana. It is, however, not all doom and gloom. As we also illustrate, positive attempts such as the Port State Measures Agreement, community-based mechanisms in a Chile case study, and also, a case study from Chile. The case study is in Chile. And also the relative success of CITES. So then let's dive into what promises to be an exciting and informative panel discussion. So we will begin our panel discussion with IUU fishing and its relationship with small-scale fisheries. Alex, as I understand it, there's no settled definition for small-scale fisheries. Can you shed some light for us as to what we're usually referencing when we use the term small-scale fisheries? And I will stop sharing so that you can, yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Alana. Thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Here we go. Sorry. Second here. Can everybody see my screen sharing? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm Alex Winkler. I'm currently a junior researcher at the Centre de Ciências do Mar in Faro, Portugal. I'm also a research associate at Rhodes University, where I conducted my PhD, through which I'm associated with the One Ocean Hub, and therefore part of the early career researcher group, which was asked to format this talk. So what are small-scale fishes and why are they important? So generally, as Alana said, there are a lot of different sort of definitions of small-scale fishes. You get subsistence fishes, some even put recreational fishes into small-scale fishes, artisanal fishes, etc. And they're generally fishes that use small boats or generally coastal fisheries and are quite important for sort of local food resources. So if we compare small-scale fishes to commercial fishes, and you can see on my right where we've got comparisons between large scale and commercial. So commercial fisheries obviously catch a lot more, but in terms of how much fish is discarded to the sea, in terms of bycatch, small scale fishes almost return none because generally the fish are sort of utilized. In terms of the annual catch that goes to fish meal and fish oils, which are often used in agriculture industry, which is often termed unsustainable, small scale fishes have almost none compared to large scale fishes. Their fuel consumption is a lot lower than large-scale fishes, and they employ up to 24 times as many people. They also don't rely on damaging government subsidies. That'll be chatted on a little bit, spoken about a little bit later. So they're really important for small coastal communities, and they're often in developing nations and are really important for global food security. So the first case study I'm going to be talking about is one quite close at heart in terms of it's in South Africa. I'm not an expert on abalone, but if you're from South Africa, you've heard a lot about it, and we spoke to a few experts on it in our previous webinar. Abalone are sort of a shellfish, a mollusk. You see they've got this very nice sheen on their shell, and they're highly prized in Asian markets. Abalone are in South Africa, their current stock status, so they're heavily depleted, and the fishing pressure is categorized as heavy. And if you look at this this graph on the right, you can see that at current levels with poaching and TSC and the current total allowable catch, abalone stocks are decreasing rapidly. With only the total allowable catch, they'll increase, and with poaching and with a 60% reduction in poaching, you will see that the abalone stocks will kind of limit. So poaching seems to be a big issue. And this is essentially the IUU that is happening in South Africa in terms of abalone. So why? I mean, why are these people poaching? Well, it's just worth so much. You're getting $55 a kilo of abalone. If you can harvest a couple of kilograms of abalone a day, you're almost making a month's salary in South Africa. So, you know, these are estimates from 2007. Now the price is higher, and the exchange rate is a lot higher. So you easily can make ends meet very quickly. So where does all this abalone go? Okay, so I thought this was really interesting in terms of global supply chains, etc. And you can see that between 2000 and 2007, we had sort of most of South Africa's abalone, which is only distributed in the southern region of South Africa, or 74% at least went to Hong Kong of all abalone. There was some abalone that got shipped through other South African states, but from 2008, 2015, this drastically increased, and only 39% of all abalone that went to Hong Kong. And I must say that Hong Kong is sort of the focal point of abalone exports and where it's often re-exported out of there. So based on this, it seems like, you know, a lot of abalone is starting to be moved out of a lot of other sub-Saharan African nations, and this seems to be linked to abalone being listed as CITES Appendix 3, which states that if your specimens came from a country of re-export, you must present a CITES re-export certificate issued by the management authority of the country. So essentially, once abalone gets out of South Africa, it's still very porous in terms of where it needs to go. Including, it was also shown that in 2008, 2009, the total wild abalone fishery was a moratorium on all abalone fishing. So abalone couldn't leave South Africa unless it was farmed. So they had to find different routes. So this is why illegal abalone export went through the porous borders around Southern Africa and into other countries where it isn't really, it hasn't been categorized and isn't on there, and there aren't any issues on it. But yeah, so essentially imports versus exports are essentially the issues. You've got one regulation in one country, and you've got other regulations where the abalone is sort of arriving. And this is a big issue that needs to be solved between these countries. You can't have different sort of trade agreements and laws in these different countries that are essentially sharing goods, money for goods or goods for money. So the second case study I'm going to be speaking about is based on a big fish that I sometimes like to catch. This is a recent paper that was published last year by Sadobi de Michison, which spoke about the global trade in fish maw, which is essentially swim bladders, and mostly swim bladders come from these large-bodied fish, endemic coastal species generally, that have these large swim bladders that they use for communication between each other. And in the recent news, you will see that there has been some chat about this in the Gulf of California, where bycatch of small-scale fishers that are catching these fish just for their swim bladders are also catching these small porpoises, the Vanuita. And in 20 years, the population of these fish has almost been decimated because the price of these swim bladders are so high, fishers are almost doing anything to capture them and not utilize them for food anymore. So how do we stop this? So obviously you first say, well, there should be more police. We should just use law enforcement. Let's get to the problem. Let's get all the poachers. But it's a lot more complex than that. Poaching has been described as a form of protest and a resistance against the state, at least in South Africa. You've got marginalized communities that were marginalized during apartheid, and now they live on the coast. They have this bounty in the ocean, but they aren't allowed to utilize the resource. As soon as they get cracked down, they basically rebel against the state. So it's a big issue. It's more complex than just people breaking the law. And as you can see by the figures at the bottom, with the commercial catch going down, poaching is just increasing. And this really isn't a solution to to solving this problem, and really needs to be re-looked into. Wars are not won by killing all the foot soldiers, and you can see poachers or maybe the foot soldiers in the war, but by resolving agreements between heads of state. So it's really important to fix the problem at the top, and not the people who are actually doing the dirty work. So let's go to a little bit subtle doom and gloom. I've got a case study here that I found from Chile. I haven't been to Chile. I'd love to go to Chile. Maybe one day I'll be there. But they've got this really interesting way that they're managing their abalone fishery, at least. And it's called using TERFs, which are basically territorial user rights fisheries. And how it works is that there's basically community-based management, where you've got different communities along the coast that manage their own TERFs. They have a small MPA within the TERF, which sort of seeds abalone, though that area isn't fished, and it's all policed by the community. And then they've got their TERF, which they get a lot of fishing, and they manage it themselves, and nobody else can really fish it. So there's no state. It's sort of all left up to the communities, but it's in a formal manner with these small MPAs. So in South Africa, they're trying to do a similar thing. However, the argument is that in South Africa, we've got such low abalone stocks already. We've got issues that we don't really have the abalone left to form these TERFs without asking for assistance from commercial abalone farms. So the plan is to essentially stock areas along the coast with small abalone and grow them out, and then basically harvest them through using commercial. So almost commercial TERFs, where community TERFs, commercial TERFs. But the issues with this, and you'll see there'll be a link that'll be posted in the group. And this is it's a really good film. It's really it's for free. It's based on salmon agriculture and restocking in North America. And I think, the title, "The Road to Extinction is Paved by Good Intentions." And I think this might exactly happen in South Africa with South African abalone if this sort of carries on, by stock enhancing, using farmed animals into the, putting them back into the wild, can really have bad genetic effects and evolutionary effects on the population quite easily, and really needs to be thought out a bit better. And maybe the micro MPA solution is the way to go. I do realize that MPAs are quite contentious with small-scale fishers, but if you've got buy-in from small-scale fishers in terms of the implementation of MPAs, it might be able to work as it's done in Chile. So we can see stock enhancement as a government biological subsidy. Subsidies generally are quite bad, where MPAs are biological retirement fund. You're hedging your bets, you're putting money away for the future, for your kids, for climate change, for everything else. And I think that might be a better way, but there are always caveats to everything. So in terms of fish maw and other sort of dried fish trade, shark fin, sea cucumbers, abalone, they're all this category of dried seafood, which can essentially be distributed and transported and carried around the world very easily in a ship, deep in a ship or wherever. But and it's a really hard trade to fix, because you're not selling the whole organism. Often it's often parts of the organism. It's dried. It's hard to identify. And Sadovi, who spoke about the fish maw trade, and said it straight that developing countries are ill-equipped, and they can't manage the sources in terms of the control and to gain in the countries. It's very hard to fix the problem at the source, because often these products also come from developing nations. The only way to realistically do it is to really get down to the nitty-gritty in terms of the trade of these organisms and body parts, introduce necessary trade codes, specifically identify maw. This is specifically for fish maw as a commodity. Could be applied. The FAO introducing this as a trade category to better understand volumes, trade, and global resources. At the same time, we need to use the technology. There are initiatives such as Abalone in South Africa, which is mostly based on fish, but consumers in the East might be able to trace where their dried fish or dried abalone are coming from using apps, using sort of blockchain, social media, really get ingenuitive in terms of how do we, where's the traceability in terms of these products? Because at the moment, there's very little traceability. They're going through porous borders around Southern Africa and then getting re-exported, and nobody really knows where they come from at the start. And they're often linked to drug trades, etc., which was spoken in depth in our first webinar. And it's really sort of a doggy, it's really not great. So in terms of, from a traffic report, which has done a lot of work on South African abalone. And as you can see from their recommendations, there's nothing in terms of the recommendations based on policing and clamping on communities. It's all about CITES, financial investigations, fostering access, improving traceability, protection, addressing trade data, research into abalone trade in China, and this is where it needs to go in terms of these products. Whether it's fish more in the Gulf of California, or whether it's abalone in South Africa. We really need to figure out and clamp down on the actual trade routes, where they're being traded, how they're being imported and re-exported, and really look at these trade agreements with quite in depth. Thank you very much. Please leave your questions, and we can get to a discussion later a bit about it. But thank you for having me, and back to Alana.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Certainly a lot of interesting data and case studies, illustrative data and case studies. And I actually have a few questions, but I will, of course, leave that for later. I just reminding the audience, please remember to ask any questions. If you have any questions arising from Alex's or any of the presentations, just pop them in the Q&A section, and we'll be delighted to engage you in the Q&A segment. Okay, we will now continue our discussion with illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries of the large scale variety by examining two case studies. First, I will share some thoughts on some preliminary research with an example in the Caribbean island of Jamaica before giving the mic to Laura, who will examine the situation in our hub partner country of Ghana in West Africa. So first, if I may share. I just like to set the stage, so to speak, in terms of when we say the relationship between IUU fishing and large scale fisheries, and as you will see there's the link between what Alex would have discussed in small scale fisheries and what Mitchell will discuss in terms of trade and other measures. There is a intricate nexus, and as Alex ended on the point, there needs to be, for effectiveness, there needs to be a consideration of all 3 points in this equation, and this is the 3, I suppose, points. They can't, most likely more. So look, basically to have an idea in terms of what makes large scale fishing tick and its impacts and so on. 30% of fish harvested by live weight, according to the FAO, was exported at a value of $143 billion. This makes fish one of the most highly traded commodities and most traded of the world food sectors. And I have a diagram there from North American Fisheries Intelligence Group, kind of giving you a schema of moving from sea to plate, so to speak. And there are quite a lot of dynamics involved, a lot of points along the process, which is open to various forms of illegality, including an IUU fishing perhaps sits at the apex of this. Now, large-scale fisheries are often done by huge vertically integrated fisheries companies with vessels worth over 30 million US dollars, which move between fishery zones of several countries. Many of the companies who own these fisheries also invest in the processing aspect of the trade. However, the IUU fishing that these vessels and these operations will have damages not only on ecosystems but also economies, and often this is where it loops back to the small scale fisheries and many coastal communities, especially in developing countries. As we see at the top of the screen there, 12% of the world's population directly depend on fisheries, and greater than 90% are small scale fishers, most of which, about half of which are women. So they're also gender and north south issues involved here. Um, Now, usually one of the impacts, and this links back to damages on ecosystems, is the fact that fisheries may collapse, or the income that can be earned from fisheries is no longer as lucrative to these fishers. This can lead to an engaging in illegal activities as a means of survival, as well as supplementing the income, because a lot of the ingredients that make fishers successful fishers can also make them vulnerable to transnational organized crime. So, for example, Neil 2018 notes that in Jamaica, IUU fishing is a gateway to transnational organized crimes. And UNODC says criminals engaging in fisheries crime may be involved in a large range of illegal activities, including trafficking, human rights abuse, and this is people trafficking, human rights abuse, drug trafficking, and racketeering. Now, in the first case study, I will share with you some preliminary information from the Caribbean island of Jamaica. Jamaica is one of the larger Caribbean islands. It's an archipelagic state located in the northern Caribbean, and it's most, I guess, most of one of the most popular known Caribbean islands because of two of its famous of its many famous persons, but two of its famous nationals were the late Bob Marley and, of course, the sprinter Usain Bolt. Now, Jamaica shares maritime borders with Colombia, Cuba, Haiti, Cayman Islands, and Honduras. And right away, this tells you that it is located in a very advantageous position, and it's also not very far from Miami. So you have geographically, you have Jamaica, you have North America, South America, and Central America there. So this puts Jamaica in a very, I suppose, favorable position depending how you're looking at it. Now, Jamaica has delimitation agreements arrangements in place with Colombia and Cuba. With Colombia, they have a delimitation agreement, and with Cuba, they have something like a joint development cooperation agreement. But there is none with the remaining states. And as you will see shortly, there are issues that lead both to IUU fishing as well as transnational organized crime. Now, according to the World Bank, fisheries is a critical role in the socioeconomic and cultural lifestyle of Jamaicans, both in terms of food security and income. And one of the areas I will speak about it shortly is actually a community that sprung up because of fisheries and the richness of an area called the Pedro Bank. Now, in Jamaica, there are three categories of fishers. Basically, artisanal, near and offshore fishers. So you're basically your small scale fishers and your industrial fishers. And most of these industrial fishers, however, are not necessarily Jamaican in nature, in origin, sorry. All right, so most of the IUU fishing that is done in Jamaica is done by now Jamaica has an existing a 1965 Fisheries Act. There's a 2018 Act that has gone through most of the phases, but it's not yet in effect. Now, this new act will term vessels that are less than 15.2 meters as those engaging in small scale fisheries. And according to statistics, most of the IUU fishing is done by these vessels. However, as we will see shortly, this may be because this is the data that's available. Because not a lot of data is available for larger scale vessels, and this may be for a variety of vessels reasons, including one, you don't have a cooperative agreement in place with these states, and secondly, a lot of the activities are done clandestinely. Now, an increase in IUU fishing on industrial scale is done by fleets from Honduras, Nicaragua, and the República Dominicana, which target finfish and high value seafood such as the queen conch, spiny lobster, and sea cucumbers. So this is actually another manifestation of what Alex was speaking about in terms of abalone. They're all queen conch and so on, high priced seafood for many of the same reasons that abalone is. Now, these large scale factors are in turn triggering a decrease in fish stocks, which mean that the small scale fishers are having to use increased effort to fish, and this is now leading to destructive fishing practices. So there's been an increase in cyanide and dynamite fishing, which is also outlawed under most fisheries acts in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, and the use of inappropriate fishing gear such as spear fishing and beach seining. And spear fishing is also not outlawed in most Caribbean jurisdictions because of the negative impact on coral reefs. Now, there's evidence that profits from IUU fishing are laundered and used to facilitate tax evasion, and fishers usually engage in what is called flag hopping and changing the vessel name to elude authorities. It doesn't help that that many Caribbean states are also registries of convenience, but that's another issue for another discussion. Now, there's also clear evidence that this IUU fishing is also a gateway to illegal activities such as people trafficking, firearms, and drug trafficking. And this is exactly the case in an area which is called Rocky Point. Now, Rocky Point, the diagram to the upper left, as you see there, is located on a protrusion. What's that? A spit, whatever. And essentially, this area arose. This community began as a what we call unregularized settlement, an unplanned settlement by a group of fishers because of the proximity of the area to the Pedro Bank, which you see delineated. Now, the Pedro Bank and the Pedro Keys are by far the most richest fishing grounds in Jamaica, and if you do the geography, this also straddles onto both South and Central America. Now, this as the income from fishery has declined, we've seen an increase in the cooperation between, and I use the term loosely, cooperation between local and international criminal groups. And in Jamaica, and I was doing my research, this is not only in Jamaica, but also in Trinidad and Tobago, I suppose because of its proximity to the South American mainland. And this has shown a rise in national violent crimes, especially in coastal communities, which are portals. And this was cited in the high level panel for sustainable ocean economy. Now, basically, as I would have said before, the decline in revenue or livelihoods and also the food security from fishing has kind of acted as a push factor to increase smuggling, and in Jamaica it's mainly smuggling of narcotics and arms, arms from between Jamaica and Haiti, and narcotics obviously from, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but there's Colombia, there's Jamaica. You do the link. Now, one of the things that the 2019 report by sorry, I forget the name of the global initiative. Sorry, I forgot to put that. They highlight that there's need for more data and formal literature to get a true picture of the extent of organized crime communities, and the relationship between organized crime and fishing communities, because there's a lot of gaps in what we know, and there is, to address the problem, there will be need for more. Now the challenge is identifying ways of getting data and research done despite the illicit nature of the activities. And I will wrap up here. In these are some, and I throw this out for when we have the discussion. These are some solutions I'm thinking about, but of course this is something I have just started to myself research and think about. Perhaps in delimitation agreements and joint surveillance. And if you have a read, I believe it's been put in the chat of the global initiative report, as well as the high level panel report. Surveillance is only part of the challenge, and even at the best, even if there's cooperation with surveillance, you're talking about a wide area, and these are countries that have resource issues in terms of the people to patrol things like fuel, the equipment, and so on. So surveillance cannot be the only and legal methods, such as penalizing persons caught by either, I suppose, jail time or by fines. That is going to only do part of the issue. So some other things: assessment of the effectiveness of the Pedro Banks MPA. The area has been declared an MPA. Accession and ratification to the Port States Agreement. Is technology in terms of the role of blockchain, and is there a way to link sustainable blue economy and marine spatial planning, and the use of agreements. I will now hand over to Laura, who will look at the situation in Ghana. Apologies, Laura, I think I got carried away with my case study. Sorry, let me stop.
Alana, this is all fascinating. So thanks very much. Very, very interesting. I really enjoyed Alex's presentation as well. And I've got lots of questions. And I can see lots of questions coming up in the chat function, which is great. So I'll just try and share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work. Does that look okay to everyone? Yeah, that's great.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me to give a little bit of a talk about Ghana. I'm a political and legal anthropologist. I'm associated with One Ocean Hub, and I'm based at Strathclyde University in Scotland. And so what I'm going to do is give this case study about Ghana, but the issues that I'm going to talk about here, I think, they're very generalizable to the entire West African coast, and I'm sure if we've got observers here from that area, they might agree, but I'd be interested to hear your opinions. So fishing is a really critical sector in Ghana. Fisheries constitute 7% of GDP and employ 10% of the Ghanaian population, so around 2 million people. And it's the primary source of income for around 186 coastal villages. And I'm drawing those stats from some of the reports you'll see in the presentation, so you can look those up yourself. But effectively, it's a really important area. Fish are the primary source of protein for people in this region. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'm loosely referencing two types of fishing, and I know this is going to get me into trouble with some of the fisheries experts in this area, but we can have a debate about that. So the first is artisanal fishing, small-scale fishing of the type that Alex has discussed. So these are small boats, generally below 10 meters in length. They are labour-intensive, fishing equipped. They're often owned by individuals or by small groups of people, and their catch is relatively limited. And in Ghana, that encompasses quite a number of different types of boats. So some of the more kind of, I guess, traditional types are the wooden canoes that you can see in that picture. But you also get small boats with outboard motors. So you can consider things in that category as well, I think. And their largest, so Ghana itself has a very long coastline, and effectively there's people fishing using these kinds of boats all along that coastline, and they do vary in types of boat and gears that they're using, and also types of fish that they catch. Although in general, the largest type of fish that's caught in this area is the Sardinella species. So pelagic fish, small pelagic fish, close to the surface, generally speaking, tend to be from that family of fish. So the second group that I'm talking about is the mechanized fishing vessels, generally trawlers of the type that you see in the bottom there. And in Ghana, there's very many of these trawlers that are licensed, often, well, they should be licensed under a Ghanaian flag. And they're generally trawling for demersal, so bottom dwelling species, in the exclusive economic zone claimed by Ghana, but fairly close to shore. So they are often in the same space as the artisanal fishers. And it's this fleet that has caused very significant controversy in Ghana. If you know about this area, you probably think that's an understatement, but it's a really serious issue in this area of fishing. And the reason it's such a critical issue is because Ghana's fisheries are at very serious risk of collapse. Recent reports, lots of recent reports, in fact, indicate that if catch rates continue at its current rate, bearing in mind that those catch rates are likely underreported because so much of it is IUU fished, that those stocks will probably completely collapse within the next few years. And certainly consistently what small-scale fishers are reporting is that they're finding it very hard to catch any pelagic fish at all. So there's effectively already a crisis taking place. So we know that there's been a catastrophic decline across all fish species. Most directly obvious and significant for small-scale fishers is the decline of this Sardinella species. And that's obviously got enormous implications for food security. It puts vast populations on the coast who are living very precariously anyway at enormous risk. They're losing not only their income, but also a food source. And it also puts them at risk in the sense that, you know, fishing and fishing of this type and the fish itself are a really important part of community. They have a social function as well. So it's putting communities at risk in a much broader way. And some of the research that the One Ocean Hub team in Ghana is doing at the moment is sort of looking at that, those significances as well. So we know that the trawling fleet is catching a very large number of pelagic fish, even if they're not licensed to do so. And these are either returned directly to port for onward sales, so they're being delivered to port as official bycatch, and they're being sold on to a regional and national market, or they're being fished and then transshipped at sea via a practice called psycho-fishing, and the image at the bottom from the EJF report shows you that process. And so this is where fish that are being caught by these trawlers are being sold directly to people who come out on these specially modified artisanal canoes and buy them directly from the trawlers at sea. It is completely illegal, transshipment practice. But the fish are then returned to markets and sold in a similar way to the bycatch landings. And an EJF report in 2019 found via their own monitoring efforts that 98.9% of the pelagic species landed via these two methods were below the minimum accepted landing size that's stipulated in the 2010 fisheries regulation. So effectively, they're catching vast numbers of juvenile fish. And the reason the bycatch is so large and so many juvenile fish are being caught is it's reported because these trawlers are fishing with modified nets. So they're fishing with a much smaller mesh than they should be, and that's allowing these fish to be easily caught where they're available. So it seems very clear that the trawling fleet is having a very significant effect on fish stocks, and that's a really critical issue to consider at a time when we know that small-scale fishers are also maybe engaging in IUU fishing in various ways, but it seems to be that the trawlers who are benefiting the most from those activities. This is an issue that's been well known for a long time, and there's been lots of efforts to try and counter it. One of the kind of biggest issues is that acquiring evidence of this kind of IUU fishing and the scale of fish that's being taken is very difficult under current conditions. Policing activities are very difficult, and I'll talk about a bit more about that in the next section. So why are current efforts not working? Well, there are fisheries observers on board vessels, but they are at significant personal risk. They frequently report threats. It's very well reported that a fisheries observer disappeared from a trawler on the Ghanaian coast last year. And they are subject to attempts to bribe them to ignore the IUU fishing, which must be difficult to resist because it's happening so openly. And many have said that when they do report, there's often no response, so they feel unable to have an effect on where activity is actually going on. And EGF have tried to gather reports from crew on board the trawlers, but because much of the crew are often hired local labour, their minimum wage, they're often precarious themselves, they face many of the same problems as the fisheries observers, so it can be really difficult to get evidence that way as well. Monitoring at ports was clearly not having an effect either. I mean, psychofish is sold in ice blocks, square ice blocks, because that's how it's packaged up on board the trawlers, and it's very openly sold in local markets, and the psycho boats are tied up in local harbours, so it's fairly obvious that this trade is going on. And why is this not working specifically? Well, most obvious is a serious lack of resources, and I think anyone who works on this issue in a developing country context is going to understand that. Areas in which surveillance and monitoring of IUU fishing have been successful have generally involved huge resource and relatively high-tech equipment. That's how countries like Russia and Norway, for instance, have been relatively successful. And those kinds of resources just don't seem to be available in this context. And certainly, although Ghana, the national level has made commitments to improve monitoring, one of the biggest issues that they don't have the resource to do it. And one of the things that really interests me as an anthropologist is the complicated social climate that surrounds IUU fishing in general, in the sense that there's both conflict and cooperation between fisheries in this area. So, artisanal fishers in Ghana do feel very aggrieved by the trawling activities and by the psycho fishing phenomenon. But effectively, those taking part in psycho fishing are from the same communities. Perhaps they've turned to that because it's the only option available to them, given the depleting fish stocks and the opportunity, the rare opportunity that this presents to make a living. Local market traders have come to rely on psycho fish as the most sustainable source of fish for trade. So, because catching fish in the traditional artisanal way is so difficult now, it's more sustainable for them to buy psycho fish. And in effect, psycho fish is then pricing artisanal fishers out of the market at a local level. Even more complicated is psycho fishing itself, which, as I said, is technically illegal. But transshipment boats that carry out psycho fishing are registered with bycatch authorities at port, and they do have significant power within communities. And a few years ago, psycho fishers actually won a court case brought against them by artisanal fishers at the High Court in Accra. So it becomes quite complicated. And it does seem where conflict and mediation efforts are in process, it seems to be between groups of small-scale operators with little success so far in challenging the activities of large fishing trawlers. So you feel like you see all this effort that's going on between these groups that are relatively precarious anyway, and very little conversation and success in terms of trawler activities, that has changed from time to time, but in general. And these are the kinds of issues I think it's important to take into account when thinking about intervention and who will be negatively affected by it. And that's been one of the big themes of our project. So in terms of kind of big solutions, more robust national policy and regulation, yes, definitely needed. And there's lots of moves in that direction, but there's in fact quite a kind of bewildering array of attempts to do that. But none of them seem to have been successful at the moment. So for instance, there was a law introduced to ban foreign ownership of trawling, and the trawlers on the coast basically fly a Ghanaian flag, generally speaking, and they are listed as Ghanaian-owned businesses. But the majority are also registered as boats within China's distant fishing fleet, and they are captained generally by a Chinese crew. And that is where much of the fishing product is also being shipped out by those companies. So that attempt is currently not working in the way it was hoped. There are risks with direct intervention. It's the small scale fishers who tend to fall under easy surveillance. It's people who turn to psycho fishing because stocks are dwindling. If trawlers are detained, as in other places, it's maybe labourers on board who are being arrested, and it's very difficult to prosecute the trawlers themselves. So what routes are there to kind of better targeting legislation? Well, there's things like granting rights, further legal rights to small-scale artisanal fishers, and we could have a whole separate webinar on that topic, particularly in terms of elevating customs and customary law, and that's something again that the Ghana team, the One Ocean Hub team based in Ghana are working very hard on, understanding and looking at ways that could be could produce some impact. And then there's things like direct market interventions, not necessarily at the local level, although I think that should be part of conversation, but also at the international level. So we know that trawler activity is driven by an international market, it's operated by transnational vessels with large stocks destined for the European Union. And it would be really interesting to talk about what further intervention we could do in that direction, and I'm looking forward to Mitchell's thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your presentation in our hub country, based on our experiences in our hub country in Ghana. Now, one of the enabling factors which promotes illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing is the demand side of this equation. Mitchell, tell us how trade and market-based measures can fit into this whole equation, and how they may help address some of the issues we've been discussing.
Yeah, super. Thanks. Thanks so much, Alana. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Let me just share my screen. Is that all clear for everyone? Just give me a wee thumbs up. Awesome, cool. Yeah, super. Thanks so much, Alana. So yeah, my name is Mitchell Lennon. I am a PhD researcher at the University of Strathclyde in International Fisheries Law. I'm also a member of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, and of course affiliated with the One Ocean Hub. Now, this presentation is on trade and market-related measures to combat the trade in illegally harvested fisheries products. It's based on a report that myself and Shell colleagues undertook for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization way back in 2018. At the moment, it's going through a sort of, what to say is like a rigorous and thorough editing process at the moment at the United Nations. So it's not published quite yet. So I would like to be able to share it with you, but I can't at the moment. So this presentation is a sort of snapshot of some of our findings. Okay, so first of all, I mean, I'd like to thank my co-authors as well. So that was Stephanie Switzer at Shell, Professor Daniela Diz at the Lyle Centre at Heriot-Watt University, as well as Dr. Antonio Cardessa as well, who's also based at Shell. Now, to the contents of my presentation, I'm planning on highlighting some of the potential trade and market tools available to the international community to combat trade in illegal fish and fish products. And now this is obviously just a select few, since the presentation is brief and I don't want to kind of eat into the discussion time too much. And yeah, of course, this will try and relate to the past two interesting presentations as well. So first of all, I plan to highlight the link between trade and IUU fishing, okay, with an aim of clarifying exactly what a trade and market measure is. I'll then talk about port state measures, catch documentation schemes, the use of CITES, the Convention for International Trade of Endangered Species, and combating IUU fishing. And then, of course, we'll talk about fisheries subsidies as well, and the topic that is on everyone's lips at the WTO at the moment as well, and give you a kind of rough idea exactly where we are with those negotiations as well. And then, of course, after that, I'll give you some conclusions and then we can have a discussion. Okay, so trade and fisheries are inexplicably linked. Okay, what we've seen for the previous two presentations, and of course, the first Breaking Law of the Sea seminar, is that the barriers to combating IUU activities are weak legal and governance frameworks, okay, lack of political will, and of course limited capacity of developing states to monitor, control, and survey IUU fishing activities. Now, of course, in our report, we realise this opens up a dialogue for the merits of using trade and market-related measures to combat IUU fishing, and of course, there's growing awareness of this in the international community and the research community. So, as Alana's mentioned as well, fishing activities have, or IUU fishing activities have negative impacts on both trade and the environment. And according to FAO, these activities are responsible for the loss of 11 to 26 million metric tons of fish annually, which is the equivalent to $10 billion to $23 billion a year. Now, illegal fishing activities often use gear that is otherwise banned or fish in areas which are supposed to be protected. And so there's a knock-on effect there. Due to ecological harm caused by these activities, i.e. from bycatch of other species, mammals, seabirds, turtles, that sort of thing. And in many cases, fisheries have a very long supply chain, okay? IUU catch can be transshipped, as Laura has mentioned, traded, transported across jurisdictions, and this makes traceability of these products, so that is to say, being able to certify that they've been caught legally, incredibly difficult. So that's where trade comes in. And so the function and the purpose of trade and market related measures, at least, is to restrict, if not prohibit, IUU fish or fish products coming into the market, okay, and thus acting as a deterrent, okay. And these have emerged at the regional level through regional fisheries management organisations on the high seas, as well as through unilateral legal developments as well, through such as the EU regulation on IUU fishing. And also at the multilateral level with CITES as well. So I'll talk about those two shortly. And first of all, I'd like to talk about port state measures. Okay, if anyone can recognise this photograph here, this is Peterhead Fish Market in Aberdeen. It's one of the largest fish markets in Scotland. It's not as impressive, I guess, as the snapshots of Jamaica or Ghana and the beaches there, but Scotland has to do its best, I suppose. So port state measures are a valuable yet cost-effective tool in tackling IUU fishing, and they have increased in international attention in recent years. And this is due to the inability or unwillingness of flag states to exercise jurisdiction over vessels flying their flag. Okay, what a port state measure does is deny port access to both the landing, packaging, processing, and transshipment of fish, which cannot prove not to be the product of IUU fishing. Okay, so under international law, and that is to say the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, in suspected cases of IUU fishing, a port state can deny port access, deny transshipment or landing opportunities, request information from foreign vessels and vessels flying its flag, and inspect vessels on a voluntary basis as well. And of course, this prevents or delays market access. And of course, this is really where market forces come into play, at least with freshly caught fish as well, packed in ice, like you see in the photograph here. You know, a fish packed in ice obviously has a time limit as to when it can be sold, and the greater time between it being caught and being landed, the value of that catch decreases or it can't be sold at all. So it's an encouragement, at least, for vessels to comply with fisheries legislation, at least, and if not, then they run the risk of having their catch, unable to be sold because it's gone off effectively. Now, the FAO recommend port state measures in their non-binding international plan of action to prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing. And this voluntary document is what informs the port state measures of regional fisheries management organisations and some states as well. Now, in terms of binding legal instruments as well, the FAO Port State Measures Agreement, which came into force on its parties in 2016, is a very valuable legal tool, in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier with port state measures, it represents a sort of normative shift that we call in law from flag state enforcement, which historically hasn't really worked either because you have flag states of convenience or they're not willing or able to enforce or exercise jurisdiction on vessels flying their flag. Okay, so yeah, a kind of rundown of the Port State Measures Agreement. It contains provisions on states kind of designating ports which vessels can access. Okay. Request particular information. You find that all in Annex A of the Port State Measures Agreement. It allows them to deny access to vessels suspected of participating in IUU fishing, and also those that are listed on an RFMO so-called blacklist. Okay, so that's important too. Parties are also required to inspect vessels, report the results of that inspection to flag states. Okay, and then when IUU fishing has clearly occurred, the port state must deny access to ports and use of their services. Okay, so some of you might be thinking, some of you trade experts might be saying, okay, well, this isn't necessarily a trade measure per se. And that's because they're generally applied to specific vessels or individual vessels rather than to states. Okay, however, it's a significant mechanism for securing supply chains, okay, and as well as bolstering the operation of existing catch documentation schemes, which I'll talk about in a second. And the application of such measures, obviously, on a vessel-specific basis means there may be not market or trade-based per se, although obviously their application will have market-based effects. Okay, so I thought it was relevant to include these in the presentation. Okie dokie. Now on to catch documentation schemes. So what these do is record the origin of fish and fisheries products when these products enter the supply chain, okay, and they work to ensure greater traceability throughout their supply chain as well. Now, their effectiveness depends on a kind of number of factors, okay. Importantly, their ability to effectively trade products, as well as the active participation and cooperation of actors in the supply chain, okay, so that's key. Cooperation is key here. And indeed, barriers obviously are gaps in the supply chain. Okay, that is products slipping out of the supply chain and then back in again, like Alex mentioned in his presentation. The use of paper-based systems as well, at least the kind of forgeries and that sort of thing. And of course, the continuing presence of ports of non-compliance. And so that's maybe where the Port States Measures Agreement kind of comes in to sort of patch that issue up. Okay. And of course, yeah, ports of non-compliance, if anyone wasn't sure, these are ports which don't exercise to the fullest extent their jurisdiction to kind of combat IUU catch being landed in their ports. Okay, now way by example, the EU regulation on IUU fishing uses a catch documentation scheme which must be used if you wish to trade your fisheries product with the EU. Okay, Article 12 of that regulation requires key information that you should see on the slide there, and it also gives particular responsibility to the flag state as well. Okay, now catch documentation schemes work best at the multilateral level alongside other tools in the IUU toolbox, such as port state measures, IUU vessel lists as well, and cooperation too. Now the FAO has also clarified what makes a good catch documentation scheme through a set of voluntary guidelines that they issued. Okay, now moving on to CITES. Indeed, CITES is another tool in the trade toolbox. Okay, so CITES has a very narrowly focused mandate in regulating the access to markets and reducing the harvest pressure on species traded internationally. Okay, now the number of marine species listed in CITES appendices has increased in recent years, including sharks, whales, dolphins, seals, turtles, seahorses, corals, etc. Okay, now CITES makes use of nationally granted permits, which have different requirements depending on which appendix the species is listed in. Okay, Appendix 1 prohibits all trade apart from in very special conditions, and Appendix 2 seeks to limit trade in species to ensure sustainability. Okay, now in terms of Appendix 2 species, they don't require an import permit. And this is problematic in the context of IUU fishing, okay? If a listed species is taken illegally by a vessel, the port state is not obliged to request the CITES import permit, and the IUU catch then enters the market, okay? States parties do have customs obligations, however, under CITES to prevent Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 species from entering their jurisdiction without the correct documentation. Now, states can also apply stricter domestic measures for Appendix 2 species to get around that by requiring an import permit, okay? They can do this quite quickly, and thus listing some of the more lucrative marine species on Appendix 2, and then in conjunction with, say, a stricter domestic measure, it could then kind of become a key avenue to restrict IUU fishing products entering the market, like the one Alex mentioned in this presentation. And in addition to that, many CITES parties are also beginning to use information and communication technologies to develop electronic or e-permitting systems. Okay, and these are viewed as a way to, and I quote, counterbalance the growing complexity of CITES enforcement and increasing demand for inspection services as well. Okay, so makes these things more rigorous, but also reduces the pressure on the person on the ground as well, which I think is key. Now, just an additional thing to add on CITES as well. Due to the COVID pandemic, obviously, there is fresh attention on the international wildlife trade, and in light of the new IPBES report on biodiversity loss and its link to pandemics and disease, there are calls for the CITES framework to sort of be strengthened and re-examined, and increasing the number of species to be listed as well. Now, this could also be an opportunity for us, for those interested in combating illegal trade of marine species, to sort of ride the wave of attention and have their ideas and voices listened to. So I think this is something for discussion as well. Could we kind of utilize this attention that CITES is getting to potentially alleviate some of the issues that we've described so far? Okay, now on to subsidies. A topic, of course, on everyone's lips at the moment, especially today. There's no other distractions or anything like that. It's being negotiated at the WTO just now. Now, fishery subsidies are government actions or inactions, okay, which confer advantage to fisheries or consumers of fish in order to supplement their income or lower their costs. Okay, these actions can be a number of different things, but they're not limited to fuel tax rebates, provision of landing site facilities, investment grants, and then no resource access fees. So that's use of ports and things like that, processing facilities, that sort of thing. Now, subsidies make fishing appear more profitable and lucrative than it actually is. Okay, so this drives up the number of vessels fishing compared to the number of fishes in the sea, and thus drives overfishing, destruction of the environment, and unsustainable practices generally. Okay, and of course subsidies then fund IUU fishing in some cases. Now the latest estimate that I could find was that $35 billion was sort of the public funds went into fishery subsidies. Okay, and then for scale, that is the GDP of Latvia, which is crazy. So overfishing, overcapacity, and illegal fishing are being driven by government subsidies to industrial fishing vessels like the one mentioned in Laura and Alana's presentation. And the issue on a legal tool to eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing has been discussed at the WTO for quite some time. So I'll give you a run through of that. Now, this has been going on for near enough 2 decades. Okay, it's been an incredibly slow and stymied process for lots of different reasons. Okay, so yeah, so discussions extended to the multilateral trade regime of the WTO through negotiations on fishery subsidies. In 2001, okay, 19 years ago, there was a Doha Declaration which aims to clarify and improve WTO disciplines on fishery subsidies. And the reason for that was that the existing agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures to discipline the grant of subsidies that impact trade was ineffective at disciplining fisheries at the fishery subsidies in the fishery sector. Sorry. Now, negotiations have been ongoing at the WTO since about 2007. A draft text was put forward. There was some disagreements, and then from sort of 2011 to 2016, the whole thing was on hiatus, okay? And then we had the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals, okay, in particular Sustainable Goal 14.6. And this references the ongoing WTO negotiations on fishery subsidies. However, there was then pushed back until about 2019 to align with the deadlines for the Sustainable Development Goals. So yeah, so fast forward to this year, 2020, by the 25th of June, 2020, a draft text of subsidy discipline was introduced, okay? And then this week, happening now, Okay, a revised draft consolidated text for agreement on fisheries subsidies with a view to further focus on negotiations was put forward as well. So everything is going on this week, so please keep an eye out, okay? So yeah, I've gone through that relatively quickly because I didn't want to eat into time too much. So I'll just jump to my conclusions slide. And yeah, so to conclude, trade and market related measures, they complement existing regulatory approaches to the trade of illegal fish and fisheries products. Trade in illegal fish is addressed in numerous multilateral and regional instruments, however, not necessarily at WTO level, and there are lots of trade tools in the trade toolbox that we can use, I think, to tackle the gaps that are in some of the multilateral agreements as well. So the complementary approach of, say, the Port States Measures Agreement, catch documentation schemes, also in conjunction with the broader role of CITES as well. And then if we get somewhere with the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, I think we might be able to get somewhere as well. In addition to that, one of the conclusions of the report as well was that perhaps with the WTO, a voluntary code of conduct on illegal fishing as well, kind of built on other tools that are out there, could be established with the WTO, and that would maybe address the lack of coverage that there is in the trade system as well. So yeah, I look forward to some questions as well. I hope that wasn't too fast for you, but yeah, thank you all very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Mitchell. I thoroughly enjoyed that, mainly because it brought back some memories from my post-grad days. But these are actually what I view as critical accompaniments to what most of the mechanisms many states traditionally use to combat IUU fishing. And now, as we see it, I think we can all agree that it's expanded to more than IUU fishing per se. All right, so I think after these presentations, we now have a comprehensive idea that those sardines which you had for breakfast, lunch, or dinner may have made their way to your plate by both legal or illegal means. And so now what I wanted, so hopefully we have at least answered that question posed when we advertised the webinar. Now I want to open the webinar to any comments or questions from the audience. I see there's some questions in there. I've tried to answer at least one prior to this because they're quite interesting and rich questions. We'd also like to know what the fellows think, and if you have any experiences to share in your area in any of these aspects, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A also. So in terms of questions, I think I see there's a rather long question for me, but I'll circle back to that, mainly because the person who posed it had to leave. But if we'll get to it shortly. So I see a question here. I'm not sure who specifically it is addressed to, but I'll throw it out to the panelists. So Nathania asks, are there any cooperation initiatives in your country or region that involve global seafood corporation? Sorry. Anyone wants to anyone has idea of any cooperation, any maybe initiatives between large, like I'm taking these are large companies and maybe states and so on, to address, I suppose, the issue of IUU fishing? For example, I know, like, for example, in some states like Canada and so on, they have done, it's kind of, if you sensitize your consumers, then the global corporations kind of have to, quote unquote, fall in line, because obviously it's your consumers, you know, and you don't want your consumers not to buy your product as opposed to the other products. I know one of the things I know from when I used to be in Canada was that Canada has what you call a seafood red list. So, you know, Mitchell reference the CITES list. So basically what they did was categorize fish and seafood by either red, orange, or green, and kind of gave awareness as to why they were categorized as red, orange, and green. And I can't remember right now which companies would have want to be associated with that, but eventually it was started by an NGO. I'm trying to remember the NGO's name, can't remember right now, but basically a lot of big companies came on board because they wanted their brands to be viewed as being sustainable, because the consumers are now more aware and they were looking for brands. So if you knew that brand X did not use sustainable practices or so on, consumers may be less likely to purchase them. So that's an example I know of. But I'm sorry if I can't give more specifics, but I'm trying to pull in 10 years ago into my memory there. All righty. Okay, so I'm seeing here that there's a question on customary law, and Laura said she would have a go at it. She'll answer it in the chat. What I do know, we do have a team who is working on the customary aspect of things in Ghana, but also across the hub, and I'm sure we'll be delighted to provide their contacts. And also, if you go on the hub's YouTube page, earlier in September, we would have done a presentation, including colleagues in Ghana. Dr. Bolo Erinoso is spearheading that effort, so you can get some more information there in addition to what Laura is giving you.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I think, partly it's difficult to answer because we know that there's been successful efforts to help artisanal fishers have had success in defending their rights, for instance, to access fisheries and so on in other countries by referring to customary law and by going through a process of having that customary law recognised officially in courts, for instance. And as I mentioned in the chat, One Ocean Hub colleague Jackie Sunday's work has focused on this in South Africa, and I think your publications will come up if you look into that, but I can also send you some details. And so the hope is that in Ghana, which has a legally plural system, so customary law is already recognised at some level, but there are customs that might be considered or should be considered law, perhaps, that are not recognised as such. That might assist regain some equity that it's felt that it's been lost in the way that oceans are governed in that region. And there are customary laws that already exist, which maybe could be used to again to help with the situation. And there are a number. I know it's a big area of research that's kind of ongoing, so I can't give you a full answer, but certainly the colleagues I've listed in the chat there are hard at work on that, and I'm trying to contribute where I can, and there's draft papers in progress. So, but it's a very interesting question, and there's a lot to say on that. So I'm sure there'll be more from the hub on that issue as we go along.
All right. I'm going to ask a question which that popped into my mind when I was listening to Alex's presentation, and I know one of the things, in the Chile case study, what you mentioned is it's a kind of variant of the marine protected area, which have had both its supporters and its detractors. How can MPAs be included in small scale, or can MPAs be included in small scale fisheries management if you're essentially barring people from fishing in historically accessible fishing grounds? Is there a rule, or is there a way that we can try to find a middle ground?
Thanks, Alana. Thanks for the question. I think MPAs are quite contentious because biologically speaking, they really, really work very well. But socially speaking, they often don't work very well because they often don't incorporate the social side of things. So you often, MPAs can actually sort of take, like you said, take away people's access to fishing rights, etc., and which has quite bad effects on really, impoverished communities. I think in certain areas, there are parts of the world where we're talking about customary law earlier, that there are sort of is evidence that MPAs and partial fishing closures and stuff are actually been driven into customary law in some way or form. In areas where it isn't already customary law, for example, I think you really need to do your homework in terms of the social studies to figure out the best places where MPAs are going to least affect people. But at the same time, you really need to communicate that MPAs are this this retirement fund. In a way, I like to see it like that, because there's a lot of evidence suggesting that in terms of fisheries induced evolution, MPAs also make the fish that leave MPAs also a lot easier to catch outside of MPAs, because you're not continually taking out bolder phenotypes of fish through fishing methods. So it's like, if you preserve these areas, it's always going to increase the benefits to fishers are always so high. But I do understand the social implications, and that really just comes down to communication, working with communities, and getting their involvement in the process of implementing MPAs, and then giving them the power to actually look after them and police them. And I think that's the only way, when it comes to especially small-scale and recreational fisheries, all sorts of small-scale fisheries, by including stakeholders into management programs is really important, because as soon as you sort of just give them rules, they rebel back. If you say there's going to be an MPA here, you need to do this, you need to catch this, people don't respond to that. The people respond well when you work with them, and unfortunately that does take a lot of time and effort and a lot of work. But when you work with communities, work in communities, give them let their voice to be heard, they're going to be pros and cons, they're going to be trade-offs between every management perspective. But at the same time, that needs to be, I really feel like, including MPAs into our global fish crisis, and especially small-scale fisheries in coastal areas is really important, and we need to put more emphasis on it. And we can't just use the sort of taking away fishing rights from people as an excuse not to include them, because inevitably the MPAs are going to benefit those people. And I really feel like, you can start implementing things like buffer zones around MPAs that maybe only artisanal and subsistence anglers have access to and nobody else does. So they still get beneficial rights, but you do need no-take zones to manage our fisheries into the future and keep our fisheries easier to make them more productive, without using stupid methods like stock enhancement that end up just having really bad evolutionary effects that we don't know about now, but will come back to bite us in 50, 100 years time.
Maybe literally.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I know two of the more successful, and one is actually quite interesting. It's a marine management area, they call it. This is in the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, called Soufri, and there's one in Dominica called Scott's Head Soufri. And I think a lot of the key is to address, as you say, the social impacts. These are community based in many respects. In the case of the SFMA, which is in St. Lucia, it's actually interesting from a legal standpoint because it's created by an MOU. So there's really no legal basis, and the MOU is signed by a very disparate set of stakeholders. And for some reason, it has worked. There's been the biological benefits of increased, and I think I could pop the article there by Gell and Roberts. They actually show that since the implementation of the management area, the increase in fish stock, and there's actually a scheme that you kind of zone the waters, that all users can both land and marine users. I think what you alluded to kind of goes into one of the questions posed to me. Uh, uh, and I do, yeah, I do, and this is also based on the reading I've been doing. I do think that surveillance and enforcement structures alone are not the answer. Um, and yes, I did mention blockchain because, as I said, this is something I've started reading on. I wouldn't definitively say that that blockchain is a route, and I could tell whoever posted this question is not a fan of blockchain. But it has been not only for fisheries, but for nature as well as oil and gas, which is another area I look at, has been proposed as a way to get rid to minimize. I don't believe in necessarily getting rid of things such as corruption and so on. But one of the things I want to draw an analogy, I think that punitive measures, command and control measures such as under the Fisheries Acts and money laundering and drug acts and so on, will only go so far. But they're not. It's the risk and the reward, and also you're in an environment where, yes, I think we can all agree that people trafficking, money laundering, drug trafficking, arms trafficking are hugely wrong and illegal practices. But and this takes me back to my days when you go on the ground, you go to a community of fishers, or you go to a community that you're about to put an MPA or on land protected area, and they don't have an alternative because their source of livelihood for some reason has been deprived. When you don't have a choice, you get creative, and it's all good and so on to say, yeah, I mean, in the Caribbean, certainly, for example, going to prison for many drug offenses is a maximum of 10 years unless you really, it's really grave. And a lot of people they just do the calculation. So saying, I'm gonna fine you for being caught for spear fishing, or if you're being caught with drugs or guns, I'll put you for 10, 15, 25 years. People will still do it. I think a lot, and this report that I've been reading by the Global Initiative comes back to the same thing as we just said, MPAs. It needs to be involvement and discourse with the communities that are involved and affected, and they shouldn't just be along for the ride. I'll just end on saying also, I know it's not transferable, but one of the successes in curbing poaching and so in Africa and so on has been the use of technology. Obviously, it's a lot easier on land to use some of these technologies, but this is maybe the route that we need to take to think out of the box in terms of policing, large areas. So certainly for the Caribbean, as I put in the chat, some of the challenges is that even though there's the problem, I mean, we all know that the Caribbean is a large transshipment point. In most places that there's smuggling, people know. But in our case, the equipment, the actual persons, as well as the money to buy fuel and so on, and there's not a lot of cooperation. There needs to be enhanced cooperation between persons. All right, so I think I answered maybe several questions there. And let me see. Are there any other questions anyone wanted to ask, or are there any closing comments from any of my panelists? Turning into a soliloquy on my part.
It's great though. They were great. I enjoyed listening to those answers. So
excellent questions and excellent answers, I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question about what I may have mentioned that the classification of IUU as an organized crime. Actually, this would actually be a good team to have I suppose, an entire panel discussion on. And what I will say shortly, as I said, and again, the video is available on the One Ocean Hub website. This was a point, the point that Eva raises was raised by Dehia and Moniba in our first Breaking Laws on the Sea webinar. By characterizing IUU fishing as a crime, it does set a different context. I think some of the publications, yes, it is a breach, generally a breach of the obligations there. I also question where some of there's a lot of gray area as to whether some things that are categorized as IUU fishing are entirely illegal. I mean, they may be illegal for parts of their of the process, but not all the process. So there's also that. But certainly there's uncontrovertible evidence that there's a link between IUU fishing and activities which are very much illegal at international law, at regional law, and national law. So perhaps we need to examine more of that nexus, that unholy nexus there. Not a comprehensive answer, but just enough to, I suppose. All right, so I think there are no more questions. I thank you thank you all for joining us. This was again another enjoyable experience, and I thank my fellow panelists. I thank the attendees, and I just like to say I guess we're off to have, well, for me it's lunch, and for you guys it will be dinner soon. And I certainly wouldn't be having sardines because I don't really like them, but I hope you all have a great evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. And with that, I guess we can draw our panel to a close. And yes, Michelle, I endorse that idea. We shall take a time check, a rain check on that when we are able to travel once again in a post-COVID-19-ish or a managing COVID-19-ish world. Thank you, and have a good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are.
Thanks all. Thank you, Alana.
Bye.
Everybody.
Thanks very much, Alana.